Hello, good day. Thank you for coming here to the Vancouver Unitarian Sanctuary and to all the people watching from home on our online streaming service. We acknowledge that we are situated on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. My name is Stanley Trump, not Trump, and I am a local news journalist and longtime Unitarian member. Freedom of information in journalism and law reform has been my life's main work for the past 30 years, and I wrote the book Fallen Behind, Canada's Access to Information Act in the World Context, which you can find on my website, canadafoi.ca. We are here today to discuss reforms to the BC Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, which grants citizens the legal right to obtain government records and to ensure their privacy is protected. It was passed by NDP Premier Mark Harcourt in 1992. The United Nations has declared such access to records to be a human right. To explain these issues, we're pleased to have here with us today a key player in the field, BC Information and Privacy Commissioner Michael Harvey. The Commissioner is independent from government and promotes and protects FOI and privacy rights of British Columbians. Mr. Harvey was appointed to a 6-year term as Commissioner by unanimous motion of the Legislature in 2024. From 2019 to 2024, he served in the same Commissioner role in Newfoundland and Labrador. During this term, he became a respected voice at the National Privacy and FOI table, especially in the area of health information rights, gained from his prior executive roles in Newfoundland Department of Health and the Cabinet Secretariat. Michael has lectured in public administration at the University of Guelph and the University of Toronto. He holds a BA in political science from Memorial University and an MA in political studies from Queen's University. He is an avid skier and cyclist when conditions allow, and an avid swimmer even when they don't. So, we'll start the forum. The format will be Mr. Harvey speaking for 15 to 20 minutes. Then I will ask him about Bill 9 and other topics, and then we can take questions from the floor. We have a lot of ground to cover, so without further ado, will you please welcome Information and Privacy Commissioner Michael Harvey.
Thank you for that introduction, Stanley. It's very nice to be here with you all this afternoon and anybody who's online. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. And I'm privileged to be able to live in this beautiful province with my family, surrounded by nature, which reminds me to always reflect on how that comes with both privilege and responsibility to the land itself, to the people that have lived here, and to the people that live here now. And as an officer of the British Columbia Legislature, I also acknowledge that I'm privileged to work with people across many traditional Indigenous territories covering all regions of our province. This privilege comes with the responsibility to seek every opportunity to advance goals and of truth and reconciliation as I conduct my legislative mandates and as a Canadian as I live my life. I was particularly pleased to receive this invitation from Stanley to talk with you about your legal right to access government records and to protect your privacy. But before I get started, I want to tell you about my role as BC's Information and Privacy Commissioner. While we're here today to talk primarily about access to information held by government, I want to touch briefly on the Personal Information Protection Act, or PIPA. Oh, I'm missing, sorry. Notes out of order. So my wider mandate as Information Privacy Commissioner is centered around protecting and promoting the privacy and access rights of people living in British Columbia as they are set out in 2 laws. The aforementioned Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, which I'll call FIPA, some people call FOIPA, and that applies to more than 2,900 public bodies in British Columbia, including core government, but also universities, health authorities, municipalities, and so on, agencies, boards, and commissions. And then the second act is the Personal Information Protection Act, which governs the private sector and essentially not just private businesses, but also political parties, churches, and nonprofits, charities. It's a very broad and expansive act. It's important to understand that at the OIPC, we are part of the government writ broadly, but we are not part of the executive branch of government. I don't report to a minister. We don't make the laws. I don't participate in the drafting of legislation. But instead, as an independent officer of the legislature, we enforce those two laws, and we're accountable to the legislature as a whole on doing it, not to any one sitting government. The aim of our office and other statutory officers in British Columbia is to help ensure a more transparent and accountable government. We mediate and investigate access and privacy issues, issue legally binding orders, and conduct in-depth investigations and audits into compliance with our laws. So prior to this role, as Stanley mentioned, I served for almost 5 years as Information and Privacy Commissioner in Newfoundland and Labrador, the province in which I was raised. Now, I'm going to just take a brief diversion for a moment, because while we're here today to talk primarily about access to information, I do want to touch briefly on the Personal Information Protection Act, just to cover off that side of our mandate. As mentioned, BC is one of just 3 provinces in Canada with its own private sector privacy legislation. PIPA, which turned 22 years old this year, comes with order-making power, which means that our decisions can be legally binding. In most of the rest of the country, save Quebec and Alberta, that protection is provided by my federal counterpart, the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, and his powers, at least at present, are not as strong as mine when it comes to both the scope of his authority and when it comes to his ability to issue legally binding orders. So here in British Columbia, we're particularly privileged in that way, with a stronger level of privacy protection. But now I want to move on and talk about what I think Stanley has indicated that people are most interested in talking about today, and it's certainly a topic that has been the subject of extensive public debate in recent days and weeks, and that is freedom of information, and that relates to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, or FIPA. So that statute has 2 main parts. So one provides for the freedom of information system in British Columbia, and the other provides for public sector privacy. So again, mostly I'm going to be talking about freedom of information part today. But that is also the statute that constitutes my office as an independent officer of the legislature and provides me with my authorities. So the reason why I'm dwelling on this so much is because there are 3 elements that I want you to take away that will speak to the perspective that I'm coming to speak to you today. So the first is, and again, this is we're repeating ourselves already, but this is a very important point to get across, that I am an independent and nonpartisan official. I was appointed on the basis of the consensus recommendation of an all-party committee. And I've 4 years left in my term, and if I'm so privileged to be appointed to another term, then that would also be on the consensus recommendation of an all-party committee. So I work for the legislature, I work for you, I don't work for the government of the day. I have no interest in currying the favor of the government of the day or anyone else. So the remarks that I will make to you today, and any remarks that I ever make, they arise from, they are my opinions and my opinions alone. They arise from our independent expertise and assessment, and that of the dozens of people that work in my office. The second thing that I want to mention is that the FOI system is really complicated, and overseeing it requires careful consideration of individuals' rights of access to information, among many other legal and practical considerations. So last year alone, we had 1,500 complaints and requests for review under FIPA come into our office. So I've been commissioner here for 2 years, and then before that, as mentioned, 5 years in Newfoundland and Labrador. And the expertise of the staff in my office combined to hundreds of years of expertise administering this system every day. So that's important to consider, that this is the perspective that that I'm bringing to you here today. The expertise of what it's like to oversee and administer this statute on a day-to-day basis with thousands of files over dozens of years. So the third point I want to make that speaks to the perspective I'm coming from is a situation that I see here today in British Columbia. And I see that after having worked not just in British Columbia, but in Newfoundland and Labrador, and also sitting around the table with my federal, provincial, and territorial colleagues for 7 years. And that is that here in British Columbia, we have one of the best FOI laws in the country. As you may have heard, and as I'll discuss in more detail later, their amendments to the Act are currently before the legislature. I think that FIPA will remain one of the best laws in Canada after these amendments. So yes, I have numerous priorities that I would have for reform, and I'll be raising them during the next statutory review. We have periodic statutory reviews of laws in British Columbia, and when they happen in a public forum. That's not how these amendments arose, and that is the appropriate forum for me to, I think, advance my priorities for broad policy review. But at this particular moment, when it comes to FIPA, what I'm really concerned about is about the operationalization of the FOI system, how it's working on a day-to-day basis, what I see from those 1,500 files that come before my office every year, and what I know about all of the other files that come forward. And the problem that I see every day is a problem of trust. So let me just dwell on that concept of trust for a minute. Trust, I think we're at a critical moment for trust in British Columbia, but also nationally and globally. The 2025 Edelman Trust Barometer Canada report showed that 67% of Canadians believe that government leaders mislead the public. 73% of Canadians are unwilling or hesitant to trust someone with different values or backgrounds. Nearly 7 in 10 people worldwide fear institutional leaders mislead the public. Closer to home, StatsCan research shows that only 24% of British Columbians have high confidence across major institutions, that is, police, justice system, schools, parliament, media. And my office's numbers tell a similar story. Comparing the most recent reporting year to the year previous, we noticed a more than 30% increase in the number of people reporting that public bodies fail to respond to FOI requests within legislated timelines, a 13% increase in people asking us to review public bodies' FOI decisions that they disagree with, and a 25% increase in the number of privacy complaints across the public and private sectors. So this is why it's in my mind that it's so critical that we build a relationship of trust between public bodies and the public. If we're able to do that, then public bodies will be more able to effectively discharge their duty to assist applicants in transparency, and applicants will be able to trust when public bodies try to work with them to narrow requests that those efforts will come from a place of trying to get them the documents that they really need. But today, I'm concerned that increasingly citizens here in this province don't trust the FOI system, and more, I'm convinced that public bodies don't trust it either. Citizens are coming to think that their public bodies are opaque, and I'm concerned that many are just abandoning the system altogether. Overall, FOI requests keep going down year to year. But on the other hand, other citizens are responding in a different way by submitting ever broader requests for any and all records on a given topic and refusing to narrow their request often out of a belief that the public body is trying to narrow that request out of an effort to hide things. Still other, and a small fraction, and I'll talk more about this later, a small fraction of people are becoming ever more combative in their dealings with public officials and in their dealings with our offices. And this has led to public bodies feeling like they're under siege. So something has to change here in British Columbia. The system is not working. There is a fracture in the trust relationship. This is a road that I've been down before, and I want to share that experience with you. In Newfoundland and Labrador, where I started my public service career, modern FOI legislation, the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, I'll call it ATIPA, came into force in 2007. There had been FOI legislation before, but it was largely toothless. So this was the first legislation in that province that was really meaningful access to information legislation. But it did not fit with the culture of public administration in Newfoundland and Labrador at that time. The culture there then was a very traditional Westminster system. So some of you may have seen the British television show Yes Minister. It's a very famous show. And it started in 1980 at the time that the Thatcher government was coming in. And the very first episode was called Open Government. If any of you have ever watched Yes Minister, you'd remember this. So in that episode, senior veteran public servant, Sir Humphrey Appleby, he'd be the equivalent of a deputy minister here in Canada. He was appalled at the new ministers and the new government's commitment to open government. And so let me just quote you from that episode, this exchange that Sir Humphrey Appleby was having with the younger and more naive principal private secretary, whose name was Bernard. Okay, so Bernard would be an executive assistant in today's, in Canada. So Appleby says, open government is a contradiction in terms. You can be open or you can have government. And Bernard replies, but surely the citizens of a democracy have a right to know. No, says Appleby, they have a right to be ignorant. Knowledge only means complicity and guilt. Ignorance has a certain dignity. But, Bernard said, if the minister wants, Humphrey cuts him off. You don't just give people what they want if it's not good for them. Would you give brandy to an alcoholic? Now, this is satire, but like all good satire, there was some truth in the the culture of British public administration at the time. And the Newfoundland and Labrador culture of public administration in the early 2000s was very much British. One of the primary values of the public service that I joined at that time was not openness, it was secrecy. So when this new law came in at that time, in 2007, it was incompatible with the public service culture. People didn't understand it and certainly didn't value it. Politicians and public servants alike began to find and exploit loopholes in the law in an attempt to avoid it and to conduct their business verbally to avoid creating records altogether. So when it faced its first mandatory statutory review in 2011, this is what the reviewer heard from public servants and politicians alike, that many provisions of the Act were contrary to the Westminster system of democracy. Now, statutory reviews in Newfoundland and Labrador are not like they are here in BC, which I mentioned are public and that people can see what's going on. They are usually internal and do not involve public input. And so the bill that was introduced in Newfoundland and Labrador in 2012, which was Bill 29, involved significant reductions in the right of access. They excluded the exclusion for cabinet documents was cast much more widely. The powers of the commissioner to review documents was more constrained. And while this problem emerged from a failure of the culture of public administration to change, there was a real misjudgment because having had a few years of transparency, perhaps just like a few sips of brandy, the people discovered that they had a taste for it. The government of the day badly misjudged this. There was a lengthy debate in the legislature, in a legislature where, I should point out, bills don't normally get debated at great length. And though it was forced through into law in 2012, it became what I call a zombie controversy. It kept coming back. From that point onwards, every time there was a controversy, and like anywhere else, there's always a controversy about something, journalists would submit an FOI request, as you can expect that they would do. And when eventually they couldn't get everything that they wanted, as they usually can't, they would blame Bill 29 and remind people of how upset they were about that. And then even when the information that they couldn't get actually had nothing to do with the Bill 29 amendments, they'd still blame Bill 29, and people would still get upset. It hung like an albatross around the neck of the government, so every controversy from that point onwards became a double controversy. And the government's popularity eroded and eroded. In particular, the government at that time was trying to initiate a major hydro project. It was called Muskrat Falls, and people concluded that there was some grand conspiracy to create a wall of secrecy around that mega project. And there was some truth to that. And later, when that project became what was famously characterized as a boondoggle that went more than 100% over budget and threatened the fiscal situation of the province and everyday affordability in Newfoundland and Labrador, even to this day, people blame the lack of transparency for that. And there was some truth in that too. Now, I had a front seat for all of that because at the time I worked in the Cabinet Secretariat, directly reporting to the head of the Public Service for this whole period. By 2014, the last of a string of 4 Conservative premiers was in office, this one just on an interim basis, knowing that the government was doomed in the coming general election. Tom Marshall was his name, and he appointed a full public review of the legislation and appointed a blue ribbon panel led by former Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador, Clyde Wells. And that committee, in a very unusual move, didn't just produce a report, it also produced a fully developed new bill. It was largely based, I should add, ATIP of 2015 was largely based on our very own FIPA here in British Columbia, though the oversight model is different and more suited to a small jurisdiction. It's also remarkable, that bill is also remarkable for the very tight timelines that it placed on FOI responses and the very tight timelines that it places on the OIPC in that province to turn around its inquiries. So I became intimately involved at that time because the head of the Public Service recognized that one of the reasons we ended up in the mess that we were in was because the public service culture was not, the culture, again, I want to underline that word, was not compatible with the original law. So she appointed me to pull together a multidisciplinary team and lead a whole of public service change management exercise to lay the roots for cultural change. And so I did that for 6 months using specific training that I'd obtained to drive cultural change at every level of the public service. Now, I left the privacy and information field after that brief experience for a while. I became Assistant Deputy Minister of Health, where my main FOI involvement was in responding to requests. And believe me, I got lots of them, as you do in health. But the work stayed with me, and when the Information and Privacy Commissioner position in that province opened, I raised my hand, and the rest, as they say, is history. So what are the morals of this story? Aside from its entertainment value, what can we learn from it today here in BC? So I'll say first, I've seen the challenges that come from freedom of information from every side. Second, FOI is something that people don't talk about a lot, except that it's something that they always talk about, because it is at the heart of so much of how information in our society gets out into the public domain. So people tend not to think about it very much until they think about it very much. And so this leads to my third observation, that FOI is therefore critical to trust, and when trust is broken is when things can spiral very quickly. And then finally, for an FOI system to work properly, culture matters. The culture within the public service as well as the broader culture. So let's now turn back to British Columbia, because what I'm concerned about is that there's been a fracturing of the trust relationship. We might have a good law, but if the culture of public administration becomes misaligned with the expectations of the public, then the Act will not be properly operationalized and the trust relationship will be further broken. Now, I could advocate, and I will, for dramatic improvements to the law, and I certainly have a long list of priorities, as I mentioned, but if the law is not being properly operationalized and the culture is not aligned, then we will have no foundation of trust on which to operate. I do think that we have a problem of cultural misalignment here in British Columbia, but I'll slow down because it's important to be very clear about this point. What I see here is a different cultural alignment problem than what I saw in Newfoundland and Labrador. There, in the early 2000s, the problem was that the law and eventually people's expectations prioritized transparency, but this clashed with a strong public service value of secrecy. But here, now, the problem is different. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think within public bodies that transparency is valued as strongly as it should be. But here, at a time when there's a lot of public pressure for better public services and where money is more and more scarce and social problems are ever greater, public bodies are prioritizing operations. The problem is not mainly that public bodies want to keep things secret. That's a convenient narrative, and sometimes it's true. Instead, the problem is mainly that administering the FOI system is a lot of work. It's difficult work, and it's with people that occasionally can be very difficult to deal with. And there's only so many scarce resources that can go into it. This is the main cultural misalignment problem that I'm worried about. The sense within public bodies that the FOI system is a tedious distraction. Now, I disagree, and so I think does the public. The law says, and I agree, and I think the public expects, that information in the hands of a public body belongs, by default, to the people. And that means that transparency and therefore the FOI system is core to the business of every public body, not a tedious administrative distraction. So how do we realign this cultural misalignment? So I want to pivot now and talk about what's been going on in recent years and recent days with FIPA and FOI here in BC. So since it came into force in October 1993, BC's FIPA has been reviewed 5 times by a special all-party review committees of the legislature. These statutory reviews are mandatory. The last special committee issued recommendations that led to amendments in 2021. These amendments mandated new requirement for privacy management programs, mandatory breach notification, so-called snooping offenses, and privacy impact assessments. And these were all welcome advances that my office and the then commissioner supported at the time. But the government also at that time introduced a controversial $10 application fee for any FOI request that wasn't for your own personal information. And we strongly opposed that at the time. And so that amendment didn't make it mandatory for public bodies to charge that $10 fee, but they allowed it to charge that $10 fee. And so certainly within a few days after that bill coming into force, the government introduced that $10 fee for core government, and since then it has spread. Now, still, most public bodies still don't apply the fee, but the rate at which they are applying the fee continues to increase. My predecessor, Michael McAvoy, expressed his concern that the application fee might create a barrier for some access applicants and cautioned public bodies against charging the application fee. He also launched a 6-month review of the fee to study its impact on the system. Our office continues to monitor the impact of the fee. But I just want you to think about what this particular episode says about what the cultural misalignment was. Again, I don't speak for what the government's policy priorities are, and I don't always know what they are. But I think that this can illustrate something important. That if a government its motivation was to keep things secret from you, then they would expand the class of documents that was excluded from the Act. They would undermine the Commission's authorities and do things like that. But let's be honest, if you wanted to have a secret party, you'd find a secret place to have it, you'd lock the door, you'd hire a bouncer to stand outside to not let anybody in. You wouldn't charge a $10 cover fee. Okay, you charge a $10 cover fee if you didn't buy enough food and drink, and if your venue wasn't big enough, and if you, you thought that too many people might show up at the party. Okay, that's what the problem, that's a cultural misalignment problem. That the FOI system was not being prioritized, and it was drawing resources away. Not that the government was trying to keep secrets. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't like this fee any more than Commissioner McAvoy did. But at a time when in other jurisdictions, entire classes of documents are being carved out of FOI legislation, we shouldn't mistake what the problem is. We shouldn't confuse the narrative. Now let's fast forward to today. So just over 2 weeks ago, the government here introduced a new suite of amendments to the Act. These amendments did not arise from a statutory review, but were rather more limited. In fact, they were driven actually by a priority to introduce something that government calls connected services that I'm not going to talk to you about today. I don't want to talk about those amendments. I don't think that's why people are tuned in here. But when the Act was being amended, the opportunity was also used to change some things related to the FOI system. Now, this experience with this round of amendments was quite different. My office was consulted throughout the process. Now, we didn't draft the legislation or anything, but we did engage with government to address operational problems that we were seeing. So what operational problems am I talking about? So here's where it's important to remember the perspective that I mentioned earlier, the 1,500 files that we deal with every day. That are not going to be apparent to many commentators for the bill, because you wouldn't see those 1,500 files. You don't see the hundreds of requests for time extensions that come in. They don't see the extent to which the FOI function within the public bodies has become strained and demoralized. In the past, I have seen what happens when governments lose face in FOI because they don't want to be transparent and they want to keep secrets. And they don't think that the public has a right to know things. But that's not what I see here. That's not what the motive that I see here. And you can read our orders. That's not what we are living on a day-to-day basis. Instead, what we're living is a situation in which the public bodies are stressed and overwhelmed. So we need to do things. So I won't call out other jurisdictions in Canada, but you don't need to look far to find just read the Globe Mail to get a number of other examples of jurisdictions that are introducing much more regressive amendments to FOI laws. And just on Friday, the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, we call them FIPA, they're a civil society group here in British Columbia, released a roll-up of a range of recent measures in Canada amending FIPA and calling these a horror show for transparency, and included BC's Bill 9 among them. The narrative that was presented is, and this article that FIPA produces is consistent with a lot of the other commentary that you're seeing in public on this. And that Bill 9 is being included alongside those other bills as a horror show for transparency. So listen, I'm thrilled that people are talking about transparency. I really value FIPA's advocacy and the strength of civil society here, but on this I must respectfully disagree. The narrative that governments around Canada are motivated to keep secrets is not what we're seeing here in British Columbia. Not here, not now. It's not my job to defend the bill. And I don't speak for the government. So I've stayed out until now of the debate because I don't want to get pulled into a partisan debate. But it is my duty to talk to you about our experience every day operationalizing those bills, that bill, and to tell you that our assessment of this bill is that it does not involve a retrenchment of the right of access. It does not involve a diminishment of the Commissioner's authority to protect your right of access. And it provides, among a number of other administrative changes that we'll be making, a foundation for us to repair the operationalization of the FOI system in British Columbia and build a foundation of trust for us to build more transparency on. And so I just wanted to share these perspectives with you, and I expect that Stanley and I will now have some time, and you will have some time to ask questions about them. But I think it's important to just take an honest and evidence-based appraisal of what's actually going on with this bill. Because I think if we're going to move towards a healthier, a more transparent British Columbia and a healthier democracy, we need to build that foundation of trust, and we need to align the culture. And that's what I think this is about. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I have a few questions here for you. Well, the hot topic of the day, of course, is Bill 9, introduced first reading last month. That is the Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Amendment Act 2026. This forum was planned long before Bill 9 popped up, so I wish we could talk about other things, but now it consumes all our attention, doesn't it? Well, last week in the legislature, MLAs debated it passionately for hours. I saw it on Hansard TV, as perhaps you did too, the Hansard debates on this topic, yes. Well, your office was consulted on Bill 9 and you endorsed it, yet the opposition is vigorous. Some journalists say the endorsement is an embarrassment. FIPA and journalism groups are very unhappy with it. Then Green Party MLA Rob Botterill, the lawyer who helped pass the law in 1992, said in the House, quote, Bill 9 explains the steady degradation of our democracy in BC to the point where the independent commissioner says he supports a bill that destroys the right to know. No other commissioner in Canada would ever countenance some of the amendments that are proposed in this legislation, unquote. Do their words give you any second thoughts, or are they all mistaken in some regards or misunderstanding the law?
Well, what I'll say is we didn't endorse the bill. Okay, that's not my job to endorse the bill. I indicated that I was encouraged by the collaborative approach, and this is a bill that we can work with, right? And that's the issue that I want to get across. This is something that we can work with to improve the operationalization of the bill, or of the FOI system in this province. I certainly, I mean, people say there's a lot of rhetoric when it comes to political debate, and I don't want to get drawn into that. But I can say that certainly, if our assessment was that this bill was a retrenchment of the right of access, pulled back on the right of access, that it diminished transparency in this province, and that it undermined the ability of the commissioner to provide those protections, I would be speaking out against it very strongly. But I don't think that it does. In fact, I think it provides a foundation for us to improve the operationalization of the FOI system.
Well, it seems to worry people is the expansion of discretion. And, for example, the current FOI law says agencies must respond without delay, and the amendment changes that to without unreasonable delay. It also grants these same heads of public body the authority to decide, in their opinion, whether request provides enough detail to enable an experienced employee with a reasonable effort and a reasonable amount of time to identify the record sought. Well, the officials will decide, again, what is enough and what is reasonable, but is the word reasonable not an undefined or open-ended term that could mean almost anything to anyone?
So I do not agree that those provisions increase the discretion of the heads of public body. So in the first instance, so let's talk about the without unreasonable delay. So a modern purposive approach to interpreting statutes would have read the word unreasonable in there anyway, okay? So the moving the unreasonable into delay would it has, in our assessment, no significant change. The reality is, so what it read before was without delay, and now it's added into without unreasonable delay. Now, again, we would always and always have interpreted that appropriately. And there now every day we get requests for time extensions on FOI requests in, and we approve most of them because people are asking for files that cannot reasonably be fulfilled within that 30 days. And so we need to examine the grounds on which an extension is warranted, and we need to provide that. Reasonability is always going to be part of that assessment. And so the other important thing to consider here is that all of those extensions are still subject to our approval at the OIPC. So my ability to approve those extensions is not diminished at all. There's also, you mentioned this reference to, in the opinion of the head of the public body. There's a change to that section. Again, in our assessment, and we assess that very carefully, this does not change our ability to review that assessment at all. We retain our ability to review it. And if that matter is to be challenged, we would take that to the courts. But our assessment of this act is, and I didn't write these words, but our assessment is that our ability to defend the right of access is not negatively affected at all. But let me give you two other examples. of how the Act changes that might be interpreted, if you read it, without the background knowledge and without talking to us about it, as many of these commentators did, then you might not understand what's going on here. So first, it previously, or as is the law now, if an applicant and a public body agree with each other and consent, if an applicant consents to the extension of a timeline for an FOI request, then they need to still come to us to approve that extension. That's not a useful thing for us to do, for us to be approving extensions that the public body and an applicant have agreed upon. It eats up our time, it eats up the public body's time. I would prefer that that time be spent actually answering FOI requests. So that's an example of how we have tried to focus on making changes that make administrative sense so that people can actually put work into answering FOI requests. Here's another example. Right now under the Act, if a public body is doing a research project, then they need to come to us and we need to approve that research project. We're not researchers. That's not our expertise. That's not a useful use of our time for the public body to have to come to us or for us to have to sign off on it. So that's another example. So you could interpret both of those changes as a reduction in our right of, in our powers. We don't interpret them that way. We interpret them as administrative improvements.
Well, overall, do you see any downsides to Bill 9? Anything?
What I would like to see, so the first thing I would note is we work with the government in consultation with them as they drafted this bill. We got from them and I believe that we have a partnership to get the right records in the hands of records to which people are legally entitled in their hands faster and more transparently than before. We felt that something needed to change, and I feel that we have an agreement with the government that that is our touchstone. And if it doesn't work, we'll be monitoring it to see if it works. Right. And if it doesn't, we'll change, and we can because we have retained all of our discretion in the Act. But one thing that I don't have is good metrics for all of the public bodies that are not the core government. And I really need those metrics to know if things are working well. I don't know numbers of FOI requests. I don't know full timeliness of FOI requests. I only know about complaints that come to our office. So if I had a wish list for something that would improve, it'd be metrics, and that will be one of my top priorities for the next statutory review, to call for mandatory reporting to either my office or to the government, to somebody, to the public, about FOI metrics.
Yes. Well, the MLAs in the House debated for hours with a long list of objections, and they wonder if you approve any of these features, it allows agencies to charge a new fee for proactive disclosure, expands grounds to disregard FOI requesters who are abusive, malicious, unreasonably broad, and allows commissioners to review timelines to stretch indefinitely beyond the current 90 days and many more. Are those all acceptable?
Well, so the first is a misinterpretation of what's going on in that Act. There is no ability to assess, to use a $10 fee to assess proactive disclosure. That's not what's going on in that section of the Act. Instead, it's important to understand the background of what is involved in that section. So many, and you can read government's annual reports on FOI and some of our own work on FOI to find out what's really been consuming a lot of effort in core government, and that is individuals that are looking for personal information on their own file. And the public body here in question that really is a focus of this is the Ministry of Children and Family Development. Okay, so in this case, it's people who have a history of this work because, for example, let's say maybe they've been adopted or maybe they've been on a child protection caseload and they're looking for their records. And these records can be thousands of pages long and very detailed. And so the government has been really focused on this because this consumes a huge amount of resources, and we are jointly with them trying to figure out how we can get those records in their hands faster and more transparently. Because right now, and these records are very sensitive. And so what the government is trying to do is trying to batch up those records so that they can be ready to be disclosed for people. And we were concerned, we're concerned that might then be covered by the section of the Act that's called records available for purchase. It's already there. So governments right now, if they are allowed to accept from an FOI request records that have been prepared for purchase. And we're saying, well, hold on now. If you're going to prepare these records for people that are looking for it, and it's their own personal information, then we don't want you to charge people for their own personal information. And so, in fact, the section that you pointed out does the opposite of what you're suggesting. It just makes sure that those records are not subject to that fee. So this is the issue with reviewing a statute, that it's difficult to just read from top to bottom. You really need to understand what's going on in that section. But that's what's happening there. The second thing is about malicious and abusive. You mentioned malicious and abusive things. So this is a new ground for what's called a disregard. So public bodies can apply to my office to disregard an FOI request for a number of reasons. Okay, keep in mind, they can't just do it. They need to come to our office to apply to disregard, and it's subject to our refusal. We have a pretty high bar for approving a disregard, okay, because that's an abrogation of the right of access. But increasingly, as I mentioned before, public bodies are facing a very small number of very loud people that are malicious and abusive. I'm talking homophobic attacks, I'm talking sexist attacks, I'm talking threats that are being made to officials of public bodies and our officials. We deal with this at our office, and every public body, well, maybe not everyone, but public bodies deal with this every day. My employees are harmed. I've had to contract psychologists to be on standby for my officials to consult when they've dealt with officials that are threatening them and using racist slurs and homophobic slurs against them. This is something that you wouldn't see. It doesn't show up in the newspaper. It happens every day. It has to stop. If you're talking about something that's going to harm how public bodies see the FOI system, and what their experience is every day is that their staff are subjected to malicious and abusive behavior, like that's going to harm, that is at the heart of the cultural misalignment problem. It has to stop. Yes. And so I support this particular inclusion, but I also want to remind that every single disregard has to be approved by my office.
Yes, I see. Thank you. Well, the issue of delays, again, if people say if access delayed is access denied, the BC FOI law has a 30-day response time for requests with a 30-day extension. But the world FOI legal standard is 2 weeks for reply. 14 nations actually have penalties for delays, such as fines. In Britain, America, Mexico, and Quebec, it's 20 days. Newfoundland sets a 20-day limit with 20 days for extension. And if they can do it, why not BC?
No, I agree with you on that point. I do. I agree. Why not? And so, I think we need to understand where we are here now in British Columbia. Right now, the culture of public administration in British Columbia is that the FOI system is overly burdensome and a tedious distraction that I mentioned. Well, we need to stop. We need to stop that and then build on that. Okay? And so, yeah, I mean, I think if we brought in that timeline, the response from public bodies would be, okay, well, fine, give us all, we're all the people that are going to be required to fulfill all these FOI requests. You can't just declare the timeline and then just expect it to happen. But instead, the head of the public service is trying to deal with an $11 billion deficit. So, we need to be realistic about where we are. But if we can realign the culture, we can build a foundation of trust, then I want to move towards that.
Yes, I see. Well, BC officials eternally complain about their FOI processing hardships, but then I recall Federal Information Commissioner John Grace wrote 30 years ago what he called the silent festering scandal of delays. Quote, there is simply no basis to the often heard cry that timeframes are unrealistically short or set without concern for shrinking departmental resources. Many countries that are much poorer than Canada, with far less efficient bureaucracies, manage to comply with far more stringent standards, unquote. So in their case, such as Africa or India, is it less a matter of resources than of political will?
Maybe. Political will is not my job, right? I'm not a politician. I'm a regulator. But as a regulator, dealing with 1,500 files that come in every day, I see the reality. So that's where I'm coming at it from. Do I think that the timeline should be 20 days, not 30? Yes, I do. Do I think that there should be ample resources put behind this? Yes, I do. I do believe those things. Do I want to get to a point by the end of my term where that's the case? Absolutely. Will I be pushing for tighter timelines in the next statutory review? 100%.
Yes. Well, in the matter of fees, some plead that the public already paid for the production of these records by their taxes, so they should not have to pay for them again by fees. Do you agree with it?
Well, I think that the $10, as I said before, and as I said in my remarks, I want the $10 administration fee to go away.
Yes. Like
Yeah.
a
As for the
Newfoundland,
other
yeah.
fees, I mean, yes, it's if it takes hundreds of person hours to compile general information, then all of that work by public servants is work that's being done that could be put towards the delivery of public services. So, I mean, perhaps I do feel that a fee schedule for large and really complicated requests is justified. But I also believe that public, and this is what I would really want to move towards, is for governments to be developing their policies and programs from the outset, anticipating what information people want and designing their programs in such a way so that information gets automatically released. We call that in our field transparency by default.
Yes.
So I want to move towards that.
Well, the processing fees have a real impact on people. Last week, an MLA told the House that a small-town parents group actually held a floor hockey tournament to raise money to pay for their FOI fees. But happily, they appealed to the office and got the fees refunded. But to show the value of the law, I compiled a database of 2,000 BC news stories made possible by FOI and posted on my website. But a 2003 report by BC's Information Commissioner, Mr. McAvoy, found that in the first 6 months after that $10 fee began, the number of media FOI requests had dropped by a startling 80% from a year prior, and this during deep cutbacks to the traditional news media. So it means we were reading far fewer of such news stories. Is that a problem in your view?
Well, like I said, I want the $10 fee to go away. So I think that it is not, I think that it was not something that my office supported, and it's not something that I support today. The idea that the number could go down by 80%, although it says something about how newsrooms were functioning, how they are functioning, and how the FOI system was being used. But I do maintain that we do not support the $10 application fee.
Just one more question here. I wrote a whole chapter in my book about what I call the Great Newfoundland FOI Rebellion of 2012. And if that could serve in some ways as a model for BC and Canada for the people to rise up and protest on the lawns of the legislature, which is unprecedented. And I can't imagine that in Victoria or Parliament Hill. You see, Newfoundland's a different culture, perhaps. But what's most interesting is that the panel that gave recommendations how to improve the law actually wrote draft legislation, which the government adopted into law, and which made for the experts called the best FOI law in Canada. Now, can you imagine anything like that in BC? For their 5 legislative review panels since 1998, I spoke to all of them, whose advice was always ignored by Victoria, to have their panel's draft legislation passed into law?
So the first thing I'll say is that rebellion is a very colorful word.
I
I wouldn't have, having been there, I mean, I don't particularly recall crowds of people on the lawn of the legislature,
read
except that there were always a few people hanging around in front of the legislature. You know, it's a lovely lawn. But that said, it is no question that there was ample public controversy at the time, and that the government responded after a couple of years with this Blue Ribbon panel. And I think that it's an important story, and that's why I took time to talk about that story and my experience. And yes, I think, as I said, I think that BC can learn from it. So what can we learn? What now can we learn? And one thing we can learn is that people do care about FOI. They do. And so even, you know, now, I think the reaction in the press, so far we've seen reaction in the press and in the legislature to Bill 9. I'm not sure that that necessarily translates into a public uprising or anything, but it certainly is illustration to British Columbia that amendments to FIPA on freedom of information will not go past unnoticed, and that there is a desire for more transparency. And like I said, I think that's great. I think it's really good that people are talking about transparency. Do I think that independent panels should be drafting our legislation here in British Columbia? I don't, actually. I thought that that was, in fact, I would expect that nobody was more surprised than that the legislature would take a bill, the bill that he drafted, and just pass it through the legislature than was Clyde Wells himself. And I talked to him about it. You know, that was highly unusual. Generally speaking, governments take special care that they are the ones that draft their legislation. And I think that that's an important principle. But should governments pay attention to their statutory review committees? I absolutely believe they do. And can that process produce good law? It absolutely can.
I wish they would, as I keep telling the panel, I only wish your power was equivalent to your goodwill. So it's not. Anyways, the audience questions, please. Thank you.
You mentioned, transparency by default a few moments ago, and I wondered if any of that exists at the moment. And the reason I ask is that us and other environmental NGOs are quite active in trying to get fish farms removed from our coast.
Yeah.
And we're making some headway. But it's the decommissioning part that is interesting, because that's the provincial land tenure. So none of us are really sure what happens during decommissioning, what rules are applied, and so on and so on. So that we were recently talking about doing an FOI request, and I thought, well, why don't I just write to the minister and ask, which I've done.
Yes.
And because it seems to me like hauling out an FOI request is like taking a gun to a fist fight or something. Why not just ask?
Yeah, I think that's...
And I'm wondering if you think, I'm going to give them whatever the time in the FOI thing is to respond to me, but I wondered if you think I'm going to hear back, or will I need to do an FOI, or do you really have any idea?
So you know, the FOI tool is something that, you know, I kind of feel like it should be the transparency option of last resort, right? For information that, in an ideal world, it should be a tool of last resort, because what I think that the government should be doing in the first instance is, as I mentioned, designing their programs from the outset to just pump out the data that people want. And there is some of that happening. To your question, there is some of that happening in the environmental field. There is environmental data in British Columbia that's being put out on the data. I'm not a real expert in that area. You know, as a regulator, we focus on problems, but I am aware that there are large data sets, technical data sets, that are being produced by the BC government through a portal that are accessible to environmental groups and industry groups for access. So because they need it and they're designed for that purpose. So that is an example of transparency by default. There needs to be more of that. The second level is what we call proactive disclosure. Okay, so where the government identifies information that it didn't design to be released, but that it happens to have, and that it comes to understand people want, and I think this is what you're talking about here, and that it can release, and then it prepares that and then does release it outside of the context of an FOI request. The challenge is a lot of that information that is in the hands of government was not collected in such a way that it can just be released. Like mixed in there might be people's personal information, there might be confidences of businesses and so on. It may require a certain degree of processing before it can release. And that means work, and that means people, and that means people that are doing this work and not something else. So, but we do advocate for more proactive disclosure. But those are the three levels that I think in an ideal world that I'd like to move to. The first level is broad transparency by default, and then above that, broad proactive disclosure, and then an effective FOI system as a last resort. Does that answer your question? No?
I sort of didn't expect you to, because you
Okay.
would have to have an opinion.
I can't answer the specific
you
case
did.
that you're
You
talking
did
about. I
very
don't know
well.
about it.
Yeah, but I guess I was expecting an opinion about whether I'd hear from the minister or not without doing an FOI, and
I
it's
think you probably
unfair
will.
of me to ask you. So
I mean, I would hope so. I mean, I don't know. Certainly, having worked for governments, I can say that I've worked for ministers for years, and we always responded to our correspondence. So I certainly hope that ministers here in British Columbia respond to their correspondence. Now, whether you'll get what you want, I can't say. I don't know exactly what it is that you want or how much work that is going to be involved in giving it to you.
Well, that's a question I had too. With the cultural and political differences between Newfoundland and BC, I mean, relatively speaking, when you deal with politicians and officials, in which province are they more cooperative and compliant overall?
What I'll say, as I mentioned, the culture of Newfoundland and Labrador in the public service that I joined and worked in for many years really prioritized secrecy, right? That was a real value, secrecy. And that culture began to change, and the change management process that I led was part of that. And I think we've made significant progress in that regard to understanding people's right to know. That right to access that has been recognized as quasi-constitutional in this country. So that culture began to change. Here in British Columbia, what I'll say is I don't see that. Now, I don't work within the government, so I don't have the same perspective here in British Columbia, but what I see is not that prioritization on secrecy. What I see is a different cultural problem, one where people are just under pressure to deliver public services. So I see the culture is different. I would say probably it's more modern and more transparent here, but here the problem is something different. The problem is that people are just trying to get those public services delivered.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for talking about this subject. It's very important. Many public bodies, governments, whatever, they advertise open data on their website.
Yeah.
The problem is, what is the data? Who decides what data is open, and who decides what Statistics Canada demand? And so we have the federal government who controls Statistics Canada, who demand various statistics, either on a monthly or yearly basis from different bodies. But I can look up the website of one body in BC, and I can't find the statistics. I look for that statistics for another body in Ontario, and I find it. Because we don't have proper regulations with the federal government to mandate Statistics Canada to collect the proper information all across the country and make all bodies submit that information and publish it. So that's what the problem is. If the federal government doesn't, provide or mandate that Statistics Canada and the I presume the provinces, they have some offices like Statistics Canada, but I know, as I said, I've compared, and some data in BC I have to FOI, where I can just look it up on the website of another province. So that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, you know.
Well, that's, federalism. Provinces are going to be different from each other within the spheres of their constitutional authorities. But I think the best way to make progress on that is for ministries and for the BC government and for other public bodies to hear what information people want. And, will they then respond by disclosing that information? I can't say, but I certainly know that, if citizens are vocal about what information they want, and in particular they point to other jurisdictions where that information is available, then perhaps they will respond.
Time for one more question, if there is one. Back, please. Let me play the videos.
Michael, thank you so much for coming, taking the time. So I've never put forward, my name is Glenn, I'm a member at Van U. I've never really thought about an FOI request before, so I'm just getting new information here. But I'm really curious kind of how far you can push things, because I think democracy and transparency are extremely important. So sort of two questions, part A and part B. For example, I really like what Sonia Furstenau is doing in the province. If I wanted to see something that Sonia said on the floor at a particular, let's say I wanted to know what she said about logging Clayoquot Sound or something very specific, but I didn't know what day or time, would I be able to just get that sort of sent to me by email, etc.? That's the first question. The second one is a little more provocative question. If Cabinet's discussing some issue, like they make a decision about a dam, for example, or they make a decision about not wanting to fund, choosing to fund one school district more than another or something like that, Cabinet discussions, are they open to FOI requests, for example?
So on the first instance, what did an MLA say in the legislature about a certain topic? I mean, generally speaking, if you submitted an FOI request to someone, I guess the question is, well, who would it be? But in any case, if you, they would surely respond, you can look in Hansard. And Hansard is, in the legislature, everything anybody says in the legislature is recorded, and it is made public. It's available on the website, and so you'd be able to search Hansard and get that information and figure out exactly what she said and when she said it. So all of that information, and actually the same thing is true for committees. So whenever I appear before a committee, all of that is captured and transcribed and available on the internet. So and recorded for posterity, and that's the case here and in every other province in Canada and at the federal level. So that's all available. And on the internet, you can get that. The ability to find it, that can be tricky because there's so much of it. But these days, search capabilities are getting more and more powerful. As for your second question, that's a bit trickier. So the question is cabinet confidences. So this is one of these principles of Westminster democracy, and I mentioned that a little bit in my remarks. And that is what happens around that cabinet table. So we come to understand it as a principle of our democracy that at the cabinet table, ministers should be able to have free and open discussions with each other without fear of those disagreements around that table being disclosed outside of the room, so as to make it apparent that there may have been some disagreements around that cabinet table. And this is really important for a principle that we call cabinet collective responsibility, so that when a decision is made by cabinet, it's understood that that decision is made and supported by all of it. And if any minister doesn't agree with that decision that came out, then they should be they should be obliged to resign. And so that principle of the secrecy of what we call in the law the substance of deliberations of cabinet, that is something that is held to be privileged as a principle of our democracy. But that said, there are supporting documents around the cabinet process, such as like background information and so on, that could potentially be released. And when it comes to our oversight at the OIPC, if someone is seeking a cabinet document and there's some question about whether or not it should be withheld from an FOI request or not, we can look at that at our office, and we can help determine whether or not it does disclose the substance of deliberations of cabinet or not. And that's where, so if you sought something and you didn't get it back, and it said it's because it's a cabinet confidence, and you're like, well, how am I going to know if it's a cabinet confidence or not? Because I can't see it. Well, you can come to our office, you can do what's called a request for review, and then we can look at it. And we can say, is this truly a cabinet confidence or not? And we can decide. And we can tell you, yeah, that was a legitimate exercise of the law, or it wasn't. And that's essentially how our request for review process works. That's the bread and butter of what we do. The vast majority of what we do is we look at stuff that you can't to tell you whether or not the law was correctly applied.
Thank you for that.
That's super helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I'd like to close this forum with two very short video ads that promote FOI rights. The first from Morocco and the second from the Scotland Information Commissioner. Please play the clips.
ما بغاوش يعطيوني واحد الوثيقة إدارية.
اسكت.
علاش كترفضوا تقولوا لي الحقيقة؟ علاش؟
علاش بغيتي تعرف؟
علاش كيخليوني نتسنى بلا ما يقولوا لي والو؟
وديها في سوق راسك.
وعدونا بالاصلاحات في الحي ديالنا وحتى حاجه ما دارت لينا واخا كنخلصوا الضريبه.
وهذه المعلومات ما كيعطيوهاش حتى للصحفيين وكيحسب لك غادي نعطيوها لك انت.
علاش غنسكت؟ علاش؟
من حقي نعرف. معلوم من حقي نعرف.
لا ما غنديهاش في سوق راسي.
بركة مسكتة. الوصول إلى المعلومة اللي كتخص الحياة العامة هو حق مشترك ملك لكل المغاربة. من حقنا نستعملوه.
نسولو عليه.
نطالبوا به.
ونطبقوا حنا. دستور جديد الفاتح يوليوز 2011 كينص في المادة 27 على أن الحصول على المعلومة العمومية حق أساسي مضمون كاع المغاربة.
The new Freedom of Information Act is now in force. And it means that if you ask public bodies for information they hold, you have the right to be given it. To find out how to use your new right, visit the Scottish Information Commissioner at itspublicknowledge.info.
You know, Stanley, it's very interesting that you mentioned the Scottish Information Commissioner. I had an opportunity to talk to the Scottish Information Commissioner at an international conference, and he showed me their metrics dashboard. I talked earlier about metrics that we don't have access to. Well, they have mandatory reporting of metrics, and they have an excellent dashboard that you can look at. That's what I'd like to focus on. So I'm glad that you mentioned Scotland.
Thank you for that. Well, the videos say it all. No more pacifiers, yes? Well, that's our time today. Thanks for your guest, Michael Harvey. I hope we can do this again someday, for there will always be much more to say on this topic. And thank you to the Unitarian Social Justice Committee for hosting this forum. Good afternoon.